Hello everyone. This talk is mainly about how you can build Windows 8 applications using the web stack. So maybe I'll start off with the question. So how many of you here build web applications for a living? Not a lot. So I guess how many of you here are okay? How many of you here build ASP.NET apps? Okay, those are web apps. So that's the stack we're talking about here, right? So you use ASP.NET to build web applications, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. If you're using web forms, the idea there is to kind of not have to deal with that because ASP.NET takes care of that for you. How many of you here build ASP.NET MVC apps? Yeah, quite a lot of you. So you must be dealing with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So you have full control over that. So the idea here is, with Windows 8, Microsoft introduced the web stack as a first-class supported environment for building desktop apps, right? So you could do that earlier too. There were some ways. I mean, for example, how many of you have built HTA applications, .hta files? Nobody. I'm not surprised because that was actually a way that you could build desktop apps with up until Windows 7, even on Windows 8. But now we have like full-fledged first-class support, which is completely equivalent to other technologies that you might use, like .NET or C++. So this is first-class support that we have. So that's what this session is about. This is not really a tutorial. I kind of want to take you very quickly through a series of demos about some of the key aspects of Windows 8 app development. So here again, to reiterate, we're not talking about web applications. We're talking about desktop apps, right? So these are applications that are distributed and acquired by end users through the Windows Store on Windows 8. So basically, this is about what are some of the key things that you should probably be familiar with when you are building these kinds of applications. So even though this is the same stack, even though we're using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, there are a few things that are different from how you would build a web application, especially if you're coming from an ASP.NET background. Maybe I'll ask one more question. How many of you here have built web applications using frameworks like AngularJS or Knockout.js? In fact, there's a talk today about Angular as well. So we have a couple of folks. How many of you have built Silverlight apps? Okay, a bit more. So this is a lot like that, right? So this is, you can think of Windows Store applications using this stack being like AngularJS apps or Knockout.js apps. They're basically single-page apps, right? So like like Gmail or like Office 365. So these are applications which use the web technology and give you an experience of a desktop app, right? So there is no form post that keeps happening every time you interface with the app, right? All of the UI updations, UI changes, all of that happens on the client, right? The app primarily what it does is it communicates with some kind of a server endpoint, gets the data, presents it in some interesting fashion, and then you interact with it. So Windows Store apps are exactly like that. So there's ever only one HTML page in the entire app, right? So for instance, let's just take a quick look at a blank app. Visual Studio here. So this is Visual Studio 2012 running on Windows 8. So one of the things that you will notice is that, let me just launch, zoom it here so we can see things clearly. That's fine. So Control 3, right? Oh, Control 4. All right, so you can see that there's a new template here in Visual Studio 2012 if you're running on Windows 8 called JavaScript, right? So Visual C#, Visual Basic, C++, all that we're familiar with. This is a new kid in the block. So this gives you a few templates. You can create a blank app, few starter templates, blank app, grid app, split app, and so on. So if I, let's probably start with the grid app here. Now if you notice the structure, this looks a lot like a web application if you think about it, right? So it has a JS folder which has a bunch of JavaScript files. It has one CSS file, then a bunch of other pages within the app which all have their own JavaScript and CSS files. But actually there is only one real file called default.html. So when you launch this application, what Windows does is it takes and renders this default.html. That's all, right? There's no other page that gets navigated to. Even though there is a concept of a page, so you actually don't have to worry about that fact. You can still create individual pages and work with that paradigm, but it's really an abstraction. The app actually doesn't navigate across multiple pages. So if you run the app, To the user, it does look like a multi-page app. So this is the kind of the landing page. I can click on one of these tiles and it takes me to a different page, right? So to the user, it looks like I've navigated a different page, but actually what has happened is in default HTML, there is one div called the content host or something like that. Every time you navigate from page A to page B, all that happens is it loads the contents from page B dynamically, the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, and then it simply loads it, parses it into the DOM, and then inserts that element into this single div that is there in default HTML. That's all that happens. In fact, we'll implement a navigation scheme and see how that actually works out. So that's very briefly what a Windows Store app looks like. So it's just a bunch of HTML documents, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then that gets run. On the PPT, that's pretty much it. So we'll take a look at some of these key concepts that you must be familiar with. Here we go. Promises, navigation, data binding, and ListView. So in a typical Windows Store app, right, these are some of the things that you will find yourself encountering a whole lot. The first that we'll talk about is promises. If you notice these days, pretty much anything that you do in an application tends to be asynchronous, right? So it is no longer acceptable for an application to go do something and then freeze the user interface while it's doing that, right? Earlier we kind of got used to that, right? So you click a button and the app just goes into a coma, right? And then a minute later it suddenly comes back alive because it was going and doing some work and it was doing it on the UI thread, right? Which meant that the UI was not responsive anymore. Like I couldn't do stuff with the application because the one thread in the application was busy doing something. So that is not acceptable anymore, right? So we want applications to be responsive all the time. Like even if it's doing something CPU intensive or IO intensive, the app should still be responsive. I should be able to do things with it. So in Windows Store, if you notice, pretty much any operation which is an IO operation, like making a network call or making a call to the file system, or anything that is CPU intensive, right? So you're doing some mathematical complex computation, and that takes time. All of that should happen in a background thread. It should not happen on the user interface thread. And many of the APIs in the Windows runtime itself, do that. In fact, the guidance is if any operation takes more than 50 milliseconds, don't do it on the UI thread. Do it in a background thread. So promises is an abstraction in JavaScript that allows you to deal with asynchrony in a very elegant fashion, right? So who can tell me about an asynchronous operation that you typically do in a web application? In your JavaScript, for any typical web application? Loading the messages, yes, but how do you actually implement it in JavaScript? Like what do you do? Ajax, like somebody said Ajax, right? So that's an example of an asynchronous operation. I mean, there is a synchronous way of doing it, but that's not recommended, right? Because that freezes the UI. So you do it asynchronously. You provide a callback, and then the callback gets invoked when it's complete. So you don't. So that's the same concept here, except that doesn't scale very well if you want to do a lot of asynchronous operations in sequence or in some other composition. So that's what promises are about. We'll also see navigation. So I was telling a little bit about navigation, how that there is one default HTML and the content gets loaded into it. The Windows Store applications using HTML, JavaScript, CSS, there is a library called as WinJS, right? So that is basically a helper library that allows you to kind of implement many of the UI elements and the UI paradigms in a fairly straightforward manner, right? It just makes the job easier. You can for sure build an application purely with just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It's just that WinJS has a bunch of extra, it's just a library, it's a JavaScript library which gives you, for example, a control that allows you to render a list view on the screen, right? And then it does nice transitions, it does, like a bunch of out-of-the-box functionality you get. So one of the things that WinJS supports is this concept of navigation, right? So how do you navigate from page A to page B and do that in a dynamic fashion where you're loading the HTML, loading the JS, and then inserting it into a DOM. So we'll see how navigation works. We'll talk a little bit about data binding. So folks who have worked with Knockout.js, Angular, and some of the other JavaScript frameworks would be familiar with some kind of a data binding framework, right? All these frameworks have it. So WinJS has its own data binding implementation. So we'll take a look at how that works and how you can use it. And then finally, we'll take a look at, time permitting, we'll take a look at ListView and see some of the ways, like how does a ListView really work, right? So how does data binding work with a ListView, how you can interface with it, how you can customize it. So these are some of the things that we'll take a look at. So That's it. So let's start with promises, right? So I'll go ahead and create a blank app here. Probably I'll call it promises. So this default.js is the so if you look at default.html, so I have default.js included here. As you can see, there's nothing much in the blank template. That's why it's called blank. So let's go here and see what you can do with promises. So I'll define a function called init, and maybe I'll define a function called long operation. Okay, so this is some long operation is pretend that it'll do something and that will take a long time, and I'll probably simulate it with set timeout or something. But what you can do is you can do something like this. You can say return new WinJS.promise, and to that you can pass a callback which takes 3 parameters, right? And what you're expected to do here is inside that callback implement your actual functionality, right? Go do the long running operation that you're going to do. What I will do probably here is I'll call set timeout and have that run maybe after a couple of seconds, and here what all I'll do is I'll simply call this complete method, right? So this is a very, very simple implementation of an asynchronous operation. It's not I'm just simulating asynchrony using the timeout. So these 3 parameters are callbacks that you get, right, when you create your promise. So you are expected to call complete when you successfully complete the operation, call error if something was wrong, and if you want to provide progress notifications periodically, you can do that as well by calling progress multiple times. So these are 3 callbacks. In this case, I'm just using the complete callback. So how does this actually work out? So for example, from here, I can say long operation and then pass a callback like this, right? I can say long operation that returns a promise object. The promise object has a method called then, and then I can say dot then and then do whatever I need to do here. For example, maybe here I'll just put a debugger statement. So that's pretty much it. So or maybe what I'll do is I'll go here and I'll put a h1. So probably here I'll say h1 equals, so that we can visually see that something is going on. Query selector of h1. Probably here I'll say h1 dot text content equals running. Probably here I'll say h1 dot text content equals done. So hopefully what we should see is when we run this application, you don't see anything. That's because we didn't call in it. So defining a function is not sufficient. You have to call it. I know I put a little code there that I didn't explain. I'll explain that in a moment. So you saw that it was, oh, maybe you didn't see it because the screen is too big. I don't want to fiddle around the resolutions. I'll just bring it a little bit into the center or something. Margin left 400px and margin top 100px. Maybe that will bring the oh, no hash there. So it says running, then after 2 seconds it becomes done, right? So what really happened there? And if you debug it and all, you will see exactly what you would expect. So as soon as I run this, it hits the init there. I hit F5. So basically here the UI now is responsive, right? So while that long operation was running, my UI is not frozen, right? Like if I had other UI elements during the 2 seconds or whatever the time is, I can still interface or interact with the UI. So that's the idea. And here you will notice that this composes very nicely, right? So if you have like a bunch of operations which can potentially take a long time, you can compose that very well, right? Operation 1 calls operation 2 calls operation 3, and they might all be doing things asynchronously, right? The flip side of this is if you are using callbacks the way we use with, for example, XML HTTP request, and you wanted to say make 5 XML HTTP request calls in sequence, how would you do it? You want to take a shot at it? Like, what is the straightforward, naive way of doing it? Yeah, I mean, create a request object, on ready state change, provide a callback. Inside that, you say ready state is 4, then make your next request, provide another callback, and then inside that, make another callback, right? So if you want to make 5 calls in sequence, you typically have to have nested callbacks, right? And that becomes very difficult to do. So in this case, imagine that I want to call this running operation maybe 3 times, right? and this needs, maybe I'll have some inputs, but here I'll just pretend that that is there, that I'm passing the inputs. For example, what I can do here is I can say maybe done 1 or something. Here I can say return long operation. Okay. So what am I doing here? I'm actually launching another asynchronous call, and then I can continue that here. For example, here I'll provide function that. Maybe here I'll say return done 2. Right, and I can keep going like this. So in this case, what we should hopefully see is that, you know, it says running, then it says done 1, then it says done 2, right? Promises allow you to structure your code like this. Instead of going into callback hell with nested callbacks inside nested callbacks inside nested callbacks, you can structure your code where, you know, you don't have to worry about callbacks. So all of your operations, as long as they're returning promises, you can keep chaining them like this. Right? You can keep chaining your operations continuously, like this dot then chain sequence can keep going. Right? Doesn't have to stop. So that's what promises basically allows you to do. And this is not a Microsoft invention really. This is from an initiative called as CommonJS. Has anybody heard of CommonJS here? So CommonJS is this industry-wide initiative to kind of come up with a standard library for JavaScript, like how we have for .NET and for C++ and things like that. So it's a specification as part of CommonJS. Promises is a spec from there. So this is just an implementation of it. In fact, jQuery implements promises as well, and many other libraries. So what else can you do with promises? So imagine that you need this long operation to be run like 5 times, right? So you can do things like that. For instance, what I'll do is I'll say for var I equals 0, I less than 5 plus I, right? And here I want to call that long operation 5 times. But then I want to execute some piece of code after all those 5 operations are complete. Now think of writing this yourself with callbacks, right? It becomes incredibly difficult. I mean, especially if you think that each of those callbacks can complete at arbitrary times. Like if you're making a request call, I shoot out like 5 HTTP requests. Now the third request might return first. The second might return next. The fourth one might return the third as the third response, right? So there's no control over that. So if you want to kind of write some code that runs after all of them are complete, you have to do a lot of magic, right? You have to write a lot of imperative code to make that happen. With promises, it becomes really straightforward. For instance, I can simply create an array here called, let's say, promises, and I can say promises.push of long operation, right? So basically, this loop will result in long operation being invoked 5 times, and all those promises are being saved in this array here. And then I can do something like this. I can say promise.join, and I can provide that promises array there, and then I can do this, right? So I can say function then that, maybe here I'll say text content equals done, right? Maybe I'll keep it 3 so that we don't have to wait for 10 seconds. So in this case, essentially WinJS.promise.join, I know that took 6 seconds, is a way of, you know, composing your calls. Let me show you another example that I put together earlier today. So this is the exact same thing, except I didn't write this code while on stage in front of 100 people. There you go, Composite Operation All. So if you notice, all that it does is here, all it does is it creates an array. It calls pr.push of long OP, and long OP is basically the same thing. It returns a promise, and once that is complete, it calls the complete callback and passes an operation ID so we know which one is being called. And then here all I do is I return winjs.promise.join of that array, right? And then I have a little code here to keep track of completion of every individual task. And then from init, I simply call composite operation all dot then, and inside that I set the h1's text to done, right? So let's see, in composite operation all I'm running it 5 times, and in the set timeout I'm giving some random value between 0 and 5, right? So here it says running operation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the running becomes done again, right? So you would have noticed, oh, okay. I'll probably have to reduce the resolution. what do I have here? I have this. Maybe I'll put that inside a div. Container. Okay. Margin left, margin top. All right. So it says running, and then operation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 done, and then the running becomes done, right? So essentially, in this case, what happened was this call here, winjs.promise.join, returned, or that promise got resolved when all of the promises inside that array got resolved. There is another variant of it called any. For instance, this is that winjs.promise.any, and then you can pass an array of promises. In this case, that gets resolved when any of those promises get resolved, right? So you can check that out. So here, essentially, what we should see is we should see that h1 becoming done as soon as one of the operations are done. So see, it's become done already, but the other operations are still completing, right? So there are various ways you can compose operations like this, right? And you can imagine a whole call graph of asynchronous invocation, asynchronous calls, and how they all might return promises, and you know how you can nicely structure your calls so that they happen in the order and in the sequence that you expect it to happen. So promises make this really, really simple to work with. Do we have any questions about promises? Yes.
As I understand, the Windows 8 application can be built with simple HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Correct.
And but you used some Microsoft Windows library, JavaScript library.
Yes.
But can you deploy for Windows 8?
You can use any library that you want. So there is no requirement that you have to use WinJS. WinJS just makes it easier. So for example, if you want to implement a share contract or a search contract, you know, WinJS provides nice abstractions that allow you to work with it. But you can completely not use WinJS and just build a jQuery, Angular, knockout. In fact, lots of people have done that already, and that works perfectly fine. In fact, jQuery 2.0, which went to production very recently, has first-class support for Windows 8. Now, what do we mean by that? So Windows 8 security model is slightly different from web context. So how you can make some of the calls that you can make on the web are not allowed here, right? For different reasons. Mainly because this is not a web application. So any code that runs inside a Windows 8 app actually has more privileges, right? For example, you can access the file system, you can access devices. So for that reason, there are some security checks that are made in Windows 8 apps that are not done in in web apps which run inside a sandbox. So for instance, right, if you say some element.innerHTML equals an arbitrary piece of text, right? In Windows 8 apps, they are verified, they are checked for. For instance, you might have got that text from some web API, right? A hacker might have intercepted it and injected some piece of JavaScript that is not from your code, right? So how do you deal with this situation like that? So what happens is in Windows Store apps, by default, setting something innerHTML gets sanitized. Anything like script and JavaScript and all gets removed. So jQuery and other libraries don't expect that, right? So there are some frictions that you might run into, that you might have to work with. So there are workarounds in store apps. So there is an API call that you can make to circumvent that. You can see the API is called innerHTML unsafe, right? So that it's not very subtle. So you can say set innerHTML unsafe and provide a string, and then the innerHTML will get set. So jQuery 2 now has full support for that. Another area is jQuery 2. jQuery by default does not allow cross-origin calls. That is a artifact of the web. For store apps, there is no such limitation. You can call any domain. So that's another thing that just works out of the box in 2.2. Yes?
I have one question.
Yes.
I'm just curious to know what they need
as opposed to say C#, right? It's simply a question of what you're comfortable with, right? So the idea here is to kind of, so if you are a web developer and you're familiar with these sets of technologies, telling them that, hey, look, now you have to learn XAML, which has a fairly non-trivial learning curve, might not be very appealing, right? So here the idea is, if you're a web developer, you get to kind of reuse your skills to build desktop apps, and this is first class. So from a performance point of view, from a user experience point of view, there is no compromise you're making. You get everything that you can do in a .NET app or a C++ app, you get it in a desktop app as well. I mean, JS app.
From this statement is all
Exactly. It's just a developer's preference. Yes.
If I write a native app here, is there any chance of portability between the native app and say another web app? Is there some code reusability possible, or is that?
Oh, absolutely. So see what I would, so it's in general, right? This just doesn't apply just to Windows apps. For any platform, right? It is possible to build a layer or a part of your code which is decoupled from any platform bindings, right? So that applies here as well. So if you have some piece of JavaScript, for example, right? I don't know if Box2D is a physics engine, right? It's a 2D physics engine, and it's a C++ physics engine, but there are some very smart folks who have ported it to JavaScript. You can take the Box2D JavaScript implementation and plug it into Windows Store app, and it just works because there is no platform binding there. It's just a bunch of math operations that are happening there. So that the same thing applies here. So it is possible to build like for your own application, you can build, it's just a design question. So anywhere you're interfacing with the Windows APIs, anywhere you're interfacing with a user interface element, right? Those could potentially be things that cannot be ported. So as long as you design your app in such a way that you factor out common pieces of functionality into JavaScript files and libraries, you can certainly do that. So let's move on. The next thing I wanted to kind of quickly show you was about navigation. Running slightly behind schedule here, so I'll probably show you the thing that I had built in the morning. So here is another blank app. So what I've done is in this blank app, I've simply put one div here, right? That's all there is. There's nothing else here. What I also did is I added 2 HTML pages to this project. So page1.html has that. It simply says this is page 1, and I put a href and says go to page 2.html. Then here in page 1 I have the same thing. Now what I have done in default.js is I've handled, so this is the navigation framework that is part of WinJS, right? So when you are navigating from page A to page B, this particular event gets fired. WinJS.navigation.onNavigating. So in this I'm actually doing the navigation. What I'll do here is for now I'll just comment out that piece. Oh, apparently can't do that. So what happens here is this content is basically the div that I got from my default.html, right? The content div. Here is where all my content is going to get loaded. And then location and state are basically from the event arguments. Location gives me the where I'm navigating to. And then if there is any state that I need to pass to the target page, then that can be acquired through the state parameters. Then there is this utility function that you can call to actually do the rendering. So WinJS.URL takes 3 parameters. First is the URL. Second is where it should be rendered to, the HTML element. In our case, this div ID equals content. And then the third is the state parameter. Like if you have some navigation state that you want to pass from page A to page B, which is very typical, right? In page A, I do something, maybe I fill out some form, right? And I go to page B, and the form data needs to be passed to page B. So you can pass that through the state object. And then all that page render does is, it goes to that location, loads up the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from that HTML page, dynamically inserts it into the content element, and that's it. So that's what happens here. So in the init function here, what I've done is, I've called WinJS.navigation.navigate, and I've called page1.html. Right, so if I just hit F5 now, it says this is page 1, go to page 2. Now this content is coming from page1.html, right? So this stuff here, right? And you will notice that this is actually in default HTML. For instance, if I go to default.html and put on H1 here, this is default.html, okay? Then we should see that when we navigate, right? So that is still there, and this basically went into that other div. Now if I go and click page 2, you will notice that it went to page 2 because it was a href, it's a regular anchor tag, but then it did a browser navigation, right? So essentially what happened here was the default HTML got unloaded and page2.html got loaded, as it happens in a browser, regular browser, and we don't want this, right? So we here you'll notice that all the styling and everything is gone, right? Like in default.html, some default styling is applied at the top here, right? So this is from the WinJS library, the UI dark.css. Now that styling is gone because it did a browser nav. So how can you fix that? So the point here is on navigating is the hook to do that, right? So you can implement your own custom navigation schemes however you want. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to handle that by simply overriding the once the page has been rendered, I query for all the anchor tags, I listen for the click event, I prevent the default action, and then I do a navigate, right? So just like I do a navigate here, I do a navigate to the href of that particular anchor tag, right? So here I'm basically overriding what happens when you click on an anchor tag. So with that in place, hopefully we should see that it works as we expect, right? So in this case, only the contents of the content div is being changed because because this overrides the anchor tag click. I'm not saying that you should do this for anchor tags. So this is just that I did that for that particular application, right? For any other application, you can do your own thing, right? How do you want navigation to work? When you create a grid application, it comes with a default implementation of a navigation. So, for instance, here if you see on the JS, there is one JS file called navigator.js, right? Now this is when you create. I have so far been using the blank template, right? So in this case, I use the grid template. So when you use the grid template, you get this JS by default. But you will notice that even though there's a lot of code here, because this handles like alt back, alt forward, some of the browser behaviors, but ultimately this does the same thing that we did in our simple example. I think in this case it handles on navigated or something. Yeah. So there it is. So nav.onNavigated. It provides a handler to a function. Nav is simply WinJS.navigation, so it's the same thing. It's an alias for that. WinJS.navigation.navigated, and then here it does pretty much the same thing. So that briefly was navigation. Now if you look at that app here, right, this grid app, when I go and click on one of these, you see that it's not just an abrupt change, right? So when I go to another page, it nicely animates that. There's a transition there, right? It kind of slides in from the right, and when I go back, the same thing happens. All the content is animated. So all this you get because in that on navigated, they've implemented the animation there. Simply use the CSS transition to animate those elements into the page, right? So it's so feel free to modify navigator.js to suit your own purposes. So that's very briefly about navigation. The key thing to remember there is that it's very similar. It's like a single page app. So that all your pages are, even though you work with pages, you can add HTML pages to your document. When you say WinJS.navigation navigate, it's actually loading the DOM and inserting it there. And you can intercept that process to customize that navigation however you want. Right?
Does it work only with static content, or even scripts can be imported from the other page?
Absolutely. So in that HTML page, if you say script includes some JS, all that comes. CSS, everything. Sorry? The question is, can you call web services? Yes, you can. So from the JavaScript, you can make web service calls. Like if you're using WinJS, then you can say winjs.xhr, or you can call XML HTTP request the way that we know. Or if you're using jQuery, then you can say $.ajax. All of that works. There are a couple of ways we can do that. One is you can use HTML5 web workers. So you can create a web worker and then have some piece of JavaScript run in a background thread. Or another way that you can do this is you can build hybrid Windows Store applications where my user interface is HTML JavaScript, but some parts of the functionality is implemented in C++ or .NET, right, as a component, and then I can invoke that from here. So these kinds of applications can be built. So you can do whatever you want in your C++ and .NET space. You can use your tasks and then go nuts with it. But if you want to stick purely in a JavaScript world, you can use web workers. Like a web application, right? So the UI itself is running on a single thread. So even when you're using web workers, all the limitations of web workers applies here as well. You can't pass a DOM element into a web worker, right? So you can't do all that. So you can pass data across, but the UI itself runs on a single thread. It is a single threaded application. So if you're doing anything that takes time, factor it out into a background thread. Yes, so your Windows Store app runs inside a browser container, yes. In fact, when you deploy the app, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, everything gets deployed to the end user's machine.
So we need to depend on the Internet Explorer only, or the Chrome or any other Firefox?
For Windows Store apps, it will run only in the Internet Explorer container. IE10 basically, the IE10 platform.
So we cannot run this application in Windows 7?
No, we are talking about building Windows 8 store apps.
Yeah, but we are using just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and can't we get the same with Windows 7?
So question is, can we run this on Windows 7? So Windows Store apps are completely a Windows 8 invention, right? So it's not there on Windows 7, but you, as the other person asked, like you can build your code and design your code so that parts of it are reusable on other platforms. Yes.
So what if we want to go do image manipulation kind of stuff which requires CPU intensive things like? Would it
Right.
be possible with JavaScript, or can we have a module which is done in C# or something?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I was saying earlier. You can do that. So you can, yeah. So for example, you can build a C++ WinRT component, use Direct2D, and then get the output and render it on HTML. Totally possible.
So how difficult is to break all the exceptions during all this process?
Right. So that's a great question. I don't think we'll be able to have time to cover that here, but it works really, really well. So there is a concept of WinRT component, Windows Runtime components. That probably in the Sharanya's talk. Oh no, that talk is happening in parallel to this. So she's demoing it right now. So if you like run really fast, you might see it. But it's possible to do it. So you can build a .NET component or a C++ component, and then in JavaScript you can handle that through try catch. It works exactly as you would expect. So all those have been taken care of. Yes.
The Windows 8 App Store application are also deployable on Windows 8 tablets or terminals?
Yes. The question is, are Windows Store apps deployable on Windows tablets? So yes. So Windows 8 application store applications can be deployed on all devices which run Windows 8, which is tablets, desktops, laptops, everything. The only thing that you will not be able to deploy it is to phones, right? So people ask, can we deploy this on Windows Phone 8? So that is not possible. So these are Windows 8 apps, but then everywhere Windows 8 runs, it will run, including tablets, desktop, laptops, everywhere. All right. So I'll move on to the next. Content. Width is 300px, height is 300px, and background color is some color. Okay, so that color. And what else? So that's it. So now obviously if I run this, I'll just get a square, and you won't be able to see it because it's off the screen. So I'll put a margin here as well. So maybe 200px and margin top 100px. So we just see that. Right now imagine that I want to be able to control that, right? What I can do in JavaScript, I have an object here. So just as before, I'll say then of init. So if you're wondering what is this little code that I'm writing here, in fact, let me talk about that after the binding example. Then it will make sense. So let's say I have some object here, right? Some data. And in this data, I want to have a color. So let's say yellow, right? And I want to have some text, right? And I want this to be rendered inside that particular div, right? The normal ways I can get a reference to the div, I can say dot style dot background color is this color, and so on and so forth. But there is a declarative way of doing that. That's the imperative way of doing binding data to UI, right? WinJS supports a declarative way of doing this. So what you can do is you can come to your markup and say something like this: data win bind, and you can provide an expression here that binds your data to your UI. For instance, I can say style dot background color is color. I can say text content is text, right? So basically, I'm saying that bind this property from the data object, whatever that object is, and bind it to that, right? Bind text property to that property on this particular div. So let's go ahead and do that binding. So what you need to do is you need to wrap this data inside an observable object, which you can do like this. You can say WinJS dot binding dot as, and then you pass that object there, right? So I'm simply wrapping it inside WinJS dot binding dot as. What does WinJS dot binding dot as do? It simply takes my JavaScript object and converts it into an observable object. What that means is now if I go and say data.color equals some other value, or data.text equals some other value, then the other people can be notified of it. Now this object will have things like add event listener on it, right? So I can say data.notify, and then you can provide a handler. I'm not able to recall exactly which method that is, but you can take this object now and write an event handler so that whenever that data changes, you can be notified of it and do interesting things with it. For instance, here, what I want to do is I'm going to say WinJS.binding.processAll of that particular div. So I'm going to say, what was that? Content, right? So content equals document.querySelector, and I'll get the reference to that. And then now here I can say bind. This is where the actual binding happens, right? So first is the element, and then is my data. So that's it. So this particular line of code here binds my data to the UI element, right? Now I'll go ahead and hit F5 here, and then we get a crash. I think I made a mistake in my binding expression here, so probably don't need that. Maybe. Okay, so I don't need the curly braces. The text is not visible at all, so I'll make this font size 30 points. Color is red, maybe. I don't know. All right. So now you can see that the background color of this div became yellow, and the text is whatever I gave in the JavaScript, right? So I didn't actually manually assign those properties. It happened because this particular call does that automatically. So you might wonder what is the benefit of this. For instance, imagine that I write some code like this: set interval function, let's say 3 seconds. Here I say data.color is blue or white. Okay. So now essentially, maybe here I don't need interval. You can say timeout. So now you should hopefully see that after 3 seconds, the background color changes from yellow to white, right? Now you will notice that I really didn't do anything to the UI, right? All I did is I went and changed my data here. So when 3 seconds later, when I say data.color is white, my div automatically reflects that. How did that happen? Because this particular line of statement did that binding, right? So that it's like it has an effect even later, right? After that also, if you go and make changes, it works. So I put up a different example this morning. So I'll probably give you a demo of that. Essentially, what happens here is I have a couple of divs here, and you can see that it keeps changing the background color on the text. So what's happening is I just keep changing the color to a random color every few milliseconds. So for example, every second, here I say data.color is, I pick a random color from this array, right? So it just works, right? So that's what binding is all about. So subsequently, when you change the data, it reflects on the screen. So now I can explain to you what that little init thing that I do earlier. So how does the binding really work? You say winjs.binding.processAll, right? That's where the binding actually is set up. So this is another call like that, winjs.ui.processAll. So in winjs.binding.processAll, I have to give a HTML element, and then it does the binding on that. In case of this, what happens is it walks the entire DOM and then does the binding for all elements which have that data-win-binding syntax on it. So once that is complete, then I run my init function. So that's what I'm. So as you can imagine, process all returns a promise on which I pass a callback. Then my init function runs, and I do what needs to be done. So that's briefly binding, right? So this is the core of it. So here is the binding syntax, right? So style background color and so on and so forth. You can bind whatever you want. So you can think of building entire data forms and things like that using this syntax, and then binding it to your data. And then when you can do two-way binding as well. So in this case, we saw the binding happening from the object to the screen, and you can do the other way too. I can bind the object to a text box, for instance, and when I go and change my text box data, my data changes. Right? So you can do things like that. So that's binding. Do you have any questions? Yes. So the question is there any presentation framework for building JavaScript-based applications, right? I mean, there is nothing. So you could use any of these frameworks that are already there out there. For instance, you could use Angular, which kind of implements a model view presenter kind of a model there. So in fact, this data binding model that you see here is kind of inspired from Knockout.js way of doing things, right? So yes, you can. WinJS itself doesn't impose any organizational structure for your code. you feel free to use any of the frameworks that are already out there. It's just the web platform.
Yeah, the problem is you just need to hook up with WinJS for all those kind of binding.
Not really. So you don't have to use WinJS.
If you have something like a Prism out of the box, it's much easier and much more clean.
I mean, at this point in time, there's no MVVM framework from Microsoft, but there's
Are you guys planning to have something?
not that I'm aware of. But then what I'm saying is that shouldn't stop you. It doesn't have to come from Microsoft. There are great community projects that are out there, so you should feel free to use those. In fact, that's one of the problems in the .NET community, right? Everybody wants it to come from Microsoft. Otherwise, we won't use it. There is like awesome open source community projects that are there. You should explore. Sorry?
That is what we are paying for, right?
No, the point is there are these great projects which get ignored, right? There's really outstanding work that people are doing, but because organizations want this thing, feel free to use ASP.NET Web API, MVC, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. For example, today Scott Hanselman's blog post, I don't know if you follow that, he's talking about an MVC framework called ANSIFX, which has a really interesting way of doing route mapping. You know, using a get object where you can pass a path as an indexer and then provide a lambda, and then that route gets mapped to that. So it's a pretty cool way of doing it. I mean, I've never thought about it, right? So somebody else has done it. Anyway, let me quickly show you a little bit about what ListView controls, and then we'll get done. So I'll create another blank app here. So we saw that we created a binding on a regular div, right? So there is a slightly non-trivial control here called ListView, and the syntax looks a lot similar. So you can say data-win- control, and you can say WinJS. So there are a bunch of controls that you can use. ListView is a control that presents the grouped tile view representation. For instance, this is my Windows 8 desktop here, right? So here you can see that there are a bunch of tiles that are being displayed in a particular fashion, and it's actually grouped. For instance, if I zoom out, you can see that there are groups like games, office, geeky things, SQL Server, and so on. So how can you implement an interface like that for your own applications, right? That's what a ListView gives. So this is just a control that's available in WinJS. So how do you instantiate that control? All you've got to do is just on any HTML element, just put data-win- control and give the name of the control, and that's it, right? The transformation happens in this call here, winjs.ui.processAll. So that also, apart from doing data binding, it also does control instantiation. Wherever it goes and finds data-win- control, it transforms that HTML element into that control. So what I'll do is I'll go to my CSS here and move it so that everybody can see it. So margin left is, let's say, 128px. Margin top is 80px. Win item is a special class that is applied to every item in the list view. I'll say maybe 80px, height is 80px, background color is maybe that color, and color is, let's say, white. Maybe font size is 40 points. I'll put the line height as 80px. It's also so that it gets centered vertically, and then I'll center it horizontally as well. So I've just given a bunch of styling for each item in my list view, and let's go and do some data binding. So here I'll go and say .then of init, and I'll define my init function here. So the first thing we need is, just like with our data binding example, we need the data, right? So there I took a plain old JavaScript object and converted it into an observable by calling winjs.binding.as. In this case, I'm interested in a collection, right? So for that, there is one object called as winjs.binding.list. So for instance, I'll just say 10, 20, 30. I'll initialize it with some 4 values. So that's my data, right? Now I need to take that and bind it to my numbers list. So I'll say var numbers equals document dot. Here's where I missed jQuery because it's so verbose, right? The DOM calls document.querySelector. I can just put $1 and I'm done. Numbers, what is that? Numbers. And to get the access to the actual control itself, there is this expando property that WinJS ListView Control tacks on to that. So if you say that element.winControl, you get access to all the functionality of the ListView control. For instance, I can say numbers.item data source equals my list.data source, right? So if I just go ahead and hit F5 now, you'll notice that it renders. Okay, it's barely inside the screen. It renders the list view. So this is actually a tile. Believe it or not, this is a tile just like this tile. It's just that I haven't styled it, right? But you can imagine using a different width, height, and styling it to suit your own application, right? Now that's great. But what else can I do with it? So for instance, just like with our binding example, I can go ahead and say something like this. In fact, let me create a container div here. Then I can style that and move everything inside. Otherwise, I'll have to do this margin left business for every single element, right? I'll just change this to content. Yeah. All right. So here I'll have a button. I'll probably call this add or something, and I'll call this add numbers, right? Then what I'll do is I'll go to my JS here and provide a click handler for that. So I'll say document.query selector button add event listener of click event, and we'll call a function called onAdd. So let's go ahead and define that. So here all I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some random numbers to that list. So I'll just say I less than 10 plus I, and I'll simply say list.push, maybe math.random, some number between 0 and 50, and that's it. Right. So now whenever I go and click my add button, it should add elements to my list. Now if you notice, again, I didn't do anything to my list view itself, right? All I did is I went ahead and changed my binding list. That's all I'm doing, modifying here. But because of this data binding here, that has an effect, right? Basically it's the exact same thing. It's an observable array. So the WinJS UIListView control registers itself to be notified of it whenever that array changes. So when I push a new element, that array changes, ListView gets notified, and ListView goes and does what it needs to do. Now the interesting thing here, notice that it doesn't just abruptly show up, right? It does a nice animation on top of that. If you're wondering why it is stuck with 3 rows, that's because you need to give it a height. For instance, I can come here and say height is 800 px, maybe, right? So now when I add more elements, it takes up more vertical space. So you can do things like that. Maybe I want to show a grouped view. So here I have a grouped view, right? I have one group, second group, third group. How can you get a interface like that? So what you can do is you can do something like this. So I can say items equals list. There's a function called CreateGroup to which you can pass 2 callbacks. Now this callback, I basically have to tell the control how I want my data grouped. For instance, this is just a list of numbers. Maybe I can just group it as even and odd numbers or something, right? So I just have to give an expression that computes that. So I'll say if %2 gives me 0, then return even, otherwise return odd. You need to pass 2 functions. I'll probably not go into the details of why I have to pass the same thing second time. Basically what happens is when the ListView control is going through my data source and finding the groups, it does multiple passes. In one pass it tries to find out what are all the group names, so then it builds a list of groups, and then another pass it finds out which items go into what group, right? So that is why we have 2 functions that you need to supply there. So that's it. So that's my groups. So what I'll do here is I'll say items.dataSource, and then I'll pass another property here, group data source, right? And I'll say items.groups.dataSource there. So with just a few lines of code, so what you can do here is you can see that it kind of figures out where to allocate each item, right? So all the even numbers go here and the odd numbers go there. And again, you can see that it does it in a nice transitions and animations and all of that stuff, right? So ListView is actually a pretty powerful control. For instance, imagine that apart from grouping, I also want to do sorting. So I can call another function here. So n1, n2. So this does sorting. Basically, it's a sorting operator. It's a sorting function. So here I might simply say return n1 minus n2, right? So in this case, now what's going to happen is my data is actually going to get sorted as well, right? So every time I'm adding an item, it actually goes and does it in the middle if it has to. And again, nice animations, right? So, so that's pretty much it. So that was an example of doing a list view. If you are interested in additional resources, these are some of the resources. There's a build video where by build is a conference that happens in Microsoft every year. The next one is happening in June. So there is a video there that talks about WinJS and shows you much more internal details. There is a book about building Windows 8 apps. It's from O'Reilly. There is an ebook version which is completely free. Just search for that extremely simple name, Brock Schmidt, and you will find it. Dev.windows.com is a single stop resource for, oh, I'm really sorry. I think I took 2 minutes over. Single stop resource for everything Windows development, .NET, HTML, everything. Thank you very much.